Hello and welcome to our revision video for English Language Paper 1 Question 3. For this video you will need a pen and some paper for notes, a flashcard for consolidating your understanding at the end of the video, and a copy of the practice exam question from Great Expectations, which introduces the character of Miss Havisham and you can download from Frog. Let's start by reminding ourselves of the question. This is the only question that will ask you to look at the whole source at the same time. It will always ask you how the writer has structured the extract to interest you as a reader. This means how does the extract interest you at the beginning, and then how does it change and develop to hold your interest as it moves through. The question is worth 8 marks, which is 10% of this paper and 5% of the GCSE overall. We will spend between 12 to 15 minutes on the question in the exam, therefore. The question will always give you 3 bullet points. It is expected that you will write 1 paragraph for each bullet point, so these are really useful reminders. If you ever get lost in the exam in paper 1, go back and look at your bullet points. Before we get started, let's remind ourselves what we mean by a change of focus. We need to imagine as we read any extract for paper 1 that we are seeing it through the lens of a camera. A change of focus is the way the camera moves around through the extract, focusing on different things at different stages for different reasons. For example, the camera might zoom in on an important object or character, or the camera might focus on the weather to establish the atmosphere, or the camera might suddenly focus on something surprising or shocking. To help us establish how the camera moves, we can use the following key. This key can be used really simply as you read the whole extract. As you read, you use the key in the margin to keep track of the focus and how the camera moves. Perhaps use one thing for each paragraph. This version of the key is quite long. You might want to shorten it to a few key things that you tend to find and pick up on if that helps. Now go back and read the extract from Great Expectations. Use the key as you read, thinking carefully about how the camera moves throughout the extract. What are the most significant changes? Here's an example then of what you might have identified. Don't worry about minor differences, but you should have noticed this general journey of the extract. It starts outside the house, describing the change across the door. Then there's a change of place as it moves inside, with a knock at the door to Miss Havisham's room. It then changes focus by panning to a description of the room itself, where there is no glimpse of daylight. It then changes focus again by zooming in on Miss Havisham and her rich materials. And then there is another change of time, this time a flashback or analepsis, to the fear that Pip has experienced in the past, and this is done to juxtapose Miss Havisham with the waxwork. And then finally there's a change of focus through the introduction of dialogue. Who is it? Your heart broken. Notice how I've tried to use quotations at each stage. It's really important for this question, even though it's looking at structure, that we still use references from the extract to support every point that we make. However, we can't just identify the change of focus. That won't get us many marks. We also need to analyse these changes, asking how the structure, which is the order of events, is used to interest us. To do this, we can use the language of the battle folder. Go through and annotate each change of focus with how and why it interests you, using examples from this purple box. For example, that opening outside the house, the change across the door, could be used to foreshadow the fact that Miss Havisham has tried to lock herself away from society, or perhaps it develops the sense of mystery around her identity. So let's have a look at some of the things that we might have said. Again, different ideas are fine, as long as you are thinking about how each change of focus contributes to the reader's interest. How does it add to us wanting to continue reading? How does it link to parts earlier and later in the extract? For example, the opening outside the house with a change across the door foregrounds the mystery and secrecy of the house and foreshadows how Miss Havisham has locked herself away. The change of place, moving inside, builds tension and suspense. What will await Pip? And it reveals his fear, which adds to the sinister atmosphere for readers. The panning to the description of the room and its no glimpse of daylight echoes that earlier chains across the door and suggests that Miss Havisham has locked herself away from life and the living. The next change of focus by zooming in on Miss Havisham and her rich materials establishes the irony of Miss Havisham's material wealth, her riches, but her tragic loneliness. The inclusion of that brief flashback or analepsis to Pip's experiences at the fair juxtaposes Miss Havisham with the waxwork that Pip remembers, and this adds to the sense of Pip's fear, positioning the reader to find her frightening. Finally, that change of focus by introducing dialogue not only establishes the tragedy of Miss Havisham and her broken heart, but also adds to the impression of her as frightening and intimidating. It also answers those questions that we had at the start of the extract about why she's locked herself away. It's because of her broken heart. So let's think about how we would write that up. Like paper 1 question 2, we will use T here, T paragraphs, only now the technique will be a structural technique, not a language technique. We must not talk about language techniques in this question. The technique here will always be the change of focus. For example, a change of focus by zooming in would be an example of a structural technique. We need to write a minimum of 3 paragraphs, 1 about the beginning and what it foregrounds, 2 about the extracts and how it changes focus in interesting ways. This is the minimum. We can also include other structural devices as we go along, but it must always be about how the focus changes and develops and how that interests the reader. Here is a model opening paragraph. In the beginning of the extract, the writer foregrounds the mystery and the secrecy of the house when describing the chains across the door. This interests the reader structurally because it foreshadows how Miss Havisham has locked herself away and encourages the reader to ask questions like, why is she so private? Thus establishing a mystery around her identity and the house. Have a go at writing the rest of the answer. Use your annotations and the frame on this slide to help, but also use the battle folder and the language from that purple box. To finish then, some important reminders and takeaway points. We need to use our structure key when reading the text. We have to analyse how and why the change of focus interests the reader. We must make sure we include short references and quotations throughout our answer. And we need to try and write at least 3 paragraphs minimum in the exam. 1 for the beginning of the extract, and then 2 for how it changes focus and develops. Well done, thanks for watching, and bring in your drafts for your teacher to mark.